Davis. Nick is a professor of practice at the Thunderbird School of Global Management and a managing partner at Swift Partners. Additionally, Nick is a former head of society and innovation at the World Economic Forum, and he is an author of a number of books on the fourth industrial revolution. He will be speaking on the value of practical ethics in times of digital disruption. Nick, the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me okay over there in Warsaw?
Yes, we can.
That's fantastic. Well, thanks for having me. It's a privilege to speak to you all. And today I want to build on Professor Harari's speech and speak to what we as leaders in Poland and around the world can do to tackle the different types of ethical challenges related to technology today that have been, I think many of which have been so well laid out by Uval this morning. In particular, I'm going to aim this conversation at those of you in the private sector, because that's where I think a lot of the power in these conversations lies, particularly given the reticence and reluctance of elected leaders to move in the areas that need to be moved. So I'm going to talk about ethics. As I'm sure all of you know, the field of ethics is concerned with the values and principles that govern the way we act. It's the study of what is good and what is bad behavior, what duties and obligations we owe, but it has a bad reputation. Two problems. First of all, the CEOs that I speak to on a regular basis, when you say ethics to them, they hear meaningless lists of values or very fluffy concepts. Or they see something related to risk and compliance, and it's nothing to do with value or strategy. And additionally, as Uval pointed out, we can't look to the philosophy of the past, really, to understand the unique problems we're facing today. This is really unfortunate because ethics is meant to be incredibly practical, shaping our behavior and the decisions we take. So today, and I'll share my screen here for you so that you can see the slides coming up. I'm hoping that's come up in the background there. Today, I'm going to suggest some ways that we can differentiate between the different types of ethical challenges that the new technology age, or as I call it, the fourth industrial revolution from my work with Klaus Schwab at the World Economic Forum, how the ethical challenges related to this new technology age pose some specific ethical challenges for business and for organizations, all organizations, but particularly for business leaders, and how we might respond accordingly. Now, Uval pointed out very clearly, no one, least of all me, has the answers here, but to make progress, we need better ways of framing the problem. So that's where I'm going with this presentation today, and I hope you find it useful. Now, there's a major problem for many business leaders we need to jump over first, and that is a question that might strike you, probably not many of you in the audience, given that you're listening to this, but some of you, is, do I have the right to focus on bigger ethical challenges? Shouldn't I simply, particularly following corporate law in Poland, stay laser focused on maximizing the profits of my firm? And it's interesting because it was 50 years ago today, or 50 years ago last week actually, that Milton Friedman published his famous essay, The Social Responsibility of Business is to Increase Its Profits, where he held that the sole responsibility of managers and directors is to focus on shareholder benefit and profits and nothing else. Corporations should not try and solve social problems. That should be left to governments and charitable organizations. Now, Milton Friedman would not like this presentation at all. He famously won the Nobel Prize, was an economic advisor to Reagan and to Thatcher in the UK in the 1980s, and really shaped a generation of thinking, which I think explains part of the issues and the ethical challenges that we're seeing today, this reticence of governance within business to lead. Now, not everyone agreed with Milton Friedman. The World Economic Forum, where I worked for more than a decade, was founded just a year after Friedman's essay. And Professor Klaus Schwab, the founder and executive chairman, laid out a very different theory of the firm and its requirements, stakeholder theory, saying that we need to take care of our customers, employees, and local communities as part of building business value. But the World Economic Forum and I personally go even further. Going back to what Uval pointed out, it's incredibly important, not just that businesses today, particularly those in the tech industry or purchasing, encouraging, investing in emerging technologies, look after their own employees, customers, and communities. I think there's a huge values argument here and a shareholder benefit argument in favor for collaboration across sectors to build public goods, to build for the common good, and to solve some of these bigger challenges that Uval pointed out and that many of us, including Lisa and others today, have been speaking about. So the alternative to the business of business is business is the businesses should act in the global public interest. And that's really the framing for my discussion today, which I hope kind of takes us a little bit further down the line. Now, just to give you some background back to this topic of ethics, when you do tell people what they should do, if you're a philosopher or someone arguing what is someone's duty, you normally fall down to one of three arguments. You say there's actually a legal obligation or a duty to act. Secondly, that if they don't act in that way, there'll be some bad consequences you won't like. Or third, this is just what good people do. But for me, some of the most interesting arguments in favor for businesses taking on better ethics, particularly with regard to technology, are produced by research of people like you can see in front of you. Joe Stiglitz, who kind of combated Friedman's view that markets are efficient. Elinor Ostrom, who pointed out that it's only through local collaboration of communities that you can solve commons issues, which implies that now we have global commons issues. It's really global communities of different stakeholders that need to come together. And researchers like Guylands and Page, which point out that political systems become owned by corporate interests in ways that really don't do the public good any benefits whatsoever. Now, luckily, as a result of more than 50 years of swinging the pendulum towards businesses stay out of social areas, we're seeing that move back. And in the US and many parts around the world, there is this realization that something needs to be done. Now, unfortunately, this realization is coming perhaps a little bit too late. And it's also coming at a time where the fact that we should be doing something is occurring in a time of increasing technological disruption. And it's my privilege and benefit that I don't have to explain that to you because you've just had the benefit of Uval and the conference itself is called Masters in Robots. But I will just say I'm first to admit that there are huge productivity gains and GDP upsides to the technologies that are being developed today. Those gains will only be realized through massive disruption. And that's really the challenges that we need to come to terms with. These types of disruptions happening at all are not new. As Uval mentioned, in the 18th and 19th centuries, we went through the first industrial revolution, and that period was one where young children were marginalized and harmed, where workers in multiple industries were massively upended, and it took really about 100 years for legislation to correct for some of those disruptions. More than 50 years since the introduction of the world's first Child Labour Act until it was actually enforced in any country around the world, for example. We've talked about the climate crisis, which was really a technological externality from the second industrial revolution, huge inequality being driven around the world by the third or digital revolution, and already many of the kind of specific and idiosyncratic challenges coming from the post-digital age that Uval mentioned, what I call the fourth industrial revolution. It seems to me that I may have just lost my video there for a second, so let me see if I can just come back to you. Am I back there? All right. I think I'm back on a different camera. So I want to point out there that there is a major difference that we need to care about, particularly as business leaders today. And that difference is that the sources of power, unlike particularly the second and third industrial revolutions, are coming from the private sector. And when you talk about the ethical challenges of emerging technologies, it's often the case that fingers get pointed at the executive offices and boardrooms of a number of massively profitable, hugely influential international tech companies, particularly those based in China and the United States. But it can also be found in a wealth of startups with exciting technology and disruptive businesses. And I know that there are many of you in the room today. And I guess my kind of key second point here is that it's really up to us. If you're sitting here in the Masters and Robot virtual room listening to me speak, you have incredible power to shape the outcomes of the new technological age. But the question is, how do we use it together? Because as Yuval pointed out, the stakes are massive. We are deeply technological beings. Sapiens only succeeded thanks to better technologies and better social skills than other Homo species. And as Yuval explained in Homo Deus, it's technologies that are giving us our godlike powers and threatening our notions of humanisms. Now, unfortunately, these technologies are not merely tools. They're not neutral. So this is a very famous example of the political nature and racist nature of technologies. This image is an image of Parkway bridges in New York. So Robert Moses, the architect or the master planner of New York in the early 20th century, he designed the freeways that led out of the city and the bridges that crossed over them. So the parkways are the big road underneath the bridge there. He designed the height of those bridges deliberately so that they were too short for city buses. The city buses that carried immigrants and poorer members of society living in New York could not get to the Long Island beaches, which were frequented by white middle-class New Yorkers. So this was a use of the engineering technology of the Second Industrial Revolution to deliberately exclude people. And as you can imagine, you can't just undo that kind of technology. It sits there for generations and it shapes the lived experience of people for many years. Technologies are deeply political. They're not mere tools that we can choose to use in different ways. We imbue them with our biases, with our desires, with our human flaws. And when we deploy them at scale, we change ourselves in the process. That's what we're going up against here. So I would argue that currently we're at a fork in the road. We live at an incredibly important time where we are literally today collectively writing the laws, shaping the regulations, designing the corporate policies, building the infrastructure, and researching and purchasing the technologies that will define the next 20 to 50 years of human existence. So we have a major responsibility today before too many of these technologies get completely embedded in what we expect to ethically shape our future. So which goes to me to this point of, a moment or an argument of hope in relation to what Yuval shared early, which is that ethics can be practical and there are ways to look with fresh eyes at the ethics of organizations developing, deploying, and purchasing technology, investing in technology to move in those kind of more collective decisions. If you agree with me that that's the role of business, as the World Economic Forum would say, rather than Milton Friedman's view that I laid earlier. So I'll just give one more small piece of context before I present my framework here, and that is the word ethics scares people off because it feels like it's a incredibly technical ivory tower academic exercise. But if I can borrow a metaphor from my friend, the Australian philosopher Simon Longstaff, ethics really only comes down to two questions. First of all, what do you value? And secondly, what principles, what guidelines do you believe that should help you pursue that value? So to take a Polish example, this is just a metaphor. Imagine that you're in Lodz, right? You're in a city which was transformed by and greatly contributed to the Second Industrial Revolution. And one day you decide you wanted to go to a slightly bigger city. Now, if you value Krakow more than Warsaw, you might jump in your car and head south towards the A1. But if you value Warsaw more than you value Krakow, you would probably go north and perhaps join the E30 to get to the capital. Your values, what you value more, are revealed by what you decide to aim for. But what you value, in this metaphor, the direction you go in, is not the only question you need to answer to be ethical as you move. You also need to think about your principles. Do you drive as fast as you can, changing lanes aggressively? Do you challenge the speed limit and other cars? Do you take it easy? Do you stop along the way? Do you explore back roads? Or do you take a train to be more sustainable, or a helicopter to arrive rapidly in style? These are equally important ethical questions. So practical ethics says you should consciously choose how to behave by reflecting on both what you're aiming for and how you get there. But the challenge today is that new technologies make this field of deciding these things and untangling them very difficult indeed, because we're coming up against novel challenges. And so what I want to do now is outline for you a framework for thinking about 4 different types of ethical challenges that if you manage an organization, a large organization, you will come up against very soon in terms of ethics and technology. And if you run a startup that is developing technology or looking to look at new business models which build on technologies, you will also equally really need to pay attention to these kind of 4 different problems. So this is now the practical aspect of this presentation, which I hope gives a way of making sense of some of the craziness that comes at us in the 4th Industrial Revolution. Okay, so relatively quickly, the first category here, what I call type 1 challenges, these are not really ethical issues at all. These are legal obligations, which some people will try and tell you are ethical ones. They're dressed up in ethical clothing. So sometimes companies claim that type 1 problems are really a matter of ethics and difficult decision making, when most of the time, and I think everything that falls in this bucket, they're really legal and compliance challenges. And the law takes precedence over your corporate values and your principles, your individual values. So there are a lot of challenges in the type 1 category. Since GDPR came into force, misusing or failing to safeguard the data of your customers is not an ethical slip, it's breaking the law. The same is true for cybersecurity or for how you treat your workforce or anti-corruption. Now, there may be grey areas in the law. Laws in different countries may conflict. The law evolves. But many issues in the tech world which are discussed in ethical terms today, such as whether tech firms should allow extremists to share their content, or whether gig economy workers should be independent workers or employees, they're being resolved through legislation. In which case, if you're a business, your primary concern is legal, not ethical. So that's the first category that I think is very important to distinguish. The second one is quite a different group of problems, which is a genuine ethical dilemma. Unlike in type 1, here in type 2 challenges, there's no question of doing anything illegal. It's rather that the choices you have conflict with the values and the principles of your employers and stakeholders. So Google's dilemma around Project Maven, where it was using image recognition, machine learning techniques for targeting systems for the US military, is a great example and a public one of this type of challenge. There's no law that prevents a properly vetted US company from working with the military, but Google's employees, users, shareholders were divided on the issue, many very vocally, and Google did not renew that contract. Internal emails say that cost them future defense contracts of more than $250 million or more. And there are lots of examples like this where there's no question of what's legal or not. It's just that people in your stakeholder group or within your managing board or within your employees really disagree on what the right option is. So that's the type 2 dilemma. The type 3 dilemma is a little bit different again. Type 3 is a bit like scope 3 emissions when we talk about sustainability and carbon emissions. Scope 3 emissions are all the indirect emissions that happen in your value chain, upstream and downstream of your company, that you don't have direct control over. So similarly here, type 3 challenges in the ethics of technology occur when people or organizations use your products and services in anticipated or unforeseen ways, or where there are externalities which you didn't realize. So dual use technologies are an obvious example of this challenge, where people takes an algorithm that's meant for energy system optimization and uses that to do something that you think is bad, like increase the lethality of a weapon. And another example is biased or very poorly designed technologies, like the soap dispenser with a sensor that doesn't detect black hands, or the sentencing algorithm that penalizes people of color more than white people, or those living in poor neighborhoods more than white neighborhoods. So if you value equality or inclusion, you may have a type 3 ethical challenge on your hands here. And finally, and this is where Yuval and Lisa spent a lot of their time focusing, this is the hardest, and I would argue most important type of ethical challenge that we face today, but it's different again. This is when a technology or service seems relatively benign at a small scale. You're able to control the immediate externalities. It adds value to individual firms or people. But when everyone is using it at scale, the systemic impact of that technology threatens our collective vision of what is good, what is the good life. So think about ride sharing, think about the gig economy, think about social media, as Lisa and Yuval pointed out, threatening our freedom. And somewhere that I've been looking at the moment is a rising issue for companies, I think, in the audience, is the emergence of systems that track every click, keystroke, and moment of a remote worker's time. So software such as TimeTrack or Hubstaff and others, on the one hand, these kind of systems improve productivity by constantly observing someone working from home like me. But if everyone's behavior is constantly being automatically tracked by algorithms for billing purposes or for monitoring purposes for clients, what might that do to our behaviors, and what psychological impacts could that have, and divisions could that create? So now, as I come to the end of my speech, let me quickly talk about what this means for strategy. How might you start to, how could you be helped, and how might you start to respond to these areas? Well, first of all, just by paying attention to these 4 different types of challenge, it can help you identify from a risk perspective if your company might be prone to an issue of this type before it emerges, and in what ways. And if you're an SME who's primarily a user rather than a producer, you might not have to worry about creating different types of challenges, but you will have to worry about contributing to challenges of this type by uptake, and potentially putting in new policies to deal with it. So I would argue, first of all, every business in what I would call the decade of technology regulation needs to be prepared for type 1 challenges. So all of us today should be focused on understanding what types of regulation is coming in the tech sector, what risks and opportunities that brings for the way that you create value, and to invest in compliance as well as enforcement more broadly. We might need to create some innovative governance mechanisms in the private sector with the public sector. And I think it's dangerous here to play games. Don't try and push off this regulation and make it look as though it's an ethical question when it's really a legal one. Type 2, very different strategies. Type 2s, you still need to make sure that there's not a type 1 legal issue here. But the bulk of your focus is not so much an internal risk management or compliance issue, it's stakeholder management. Here you need to have open, responsive, engaging conversations with your investors, your shareholders, your customers, your communities, with the media. You need to highlight the pros and cons of working with the military, or developing a particular product, or supporting a social perspective or cause. And you need to let the stakeholders choose. The problem with type 2 is they are genuine dilemmas. There's no Pareto optimal outcome. You will lose somehow in every choice you make, but you need to treat that as a learning opportunity and take the cost into your system and learn from it. Now, type 3, we're back more on the internal side of the matrix. Here, this is about product and system design. You can start to manage type 3 challenges by treating ethics as a feature rather than a bug in your systems, and bring as many characteristics into your control as you possibly can. Test for all the possible edge cases that you can think of. Look at Twitter's racist cropping algorithm, which was just revealed a couple of days ago. Twitter tested for bias with the way it automatically cropped images shared on its platform, but it didn't test enough to understand that the algorithm was always biasing towards white faces. And be prepared to take responsibility early with this group of problems. Now, the fourth category for me is the hardest.
Hello,
you
my
need to
name
be
is
prepared
Mieszek
for it.
Wyskorski. I'm the
It's the
Dean
one
of
where we
IMD
need the most
Business
kind of
Schools.
cross-stakeholder engagement. Here, I think it comes down to really understanding if a business model or technology that you're developing is going to have negative impacts at scale. And a startup that I work with in Australia greatly improved its platform by running the thought experiment of what if we had 80% of market share with our technology? What would that do to our relationships with young people, with government, etc.? And I think that is a really important strategy looking forward through this. Something I'm passionate about is also building and investing in public technology goods, such as open data, open tech infrastructure, and geospatial systems such as Digital Earth Africa, something that I helped start a few years ago. So now I'm out of time, and this is only a very short speech to a group of highly educated stakeholders around the world. So I expect that you'll have many questions, criticisms, alternative models, or examples in mind, and do look me up on LinkedIn if you want to connect. But I want to finish by going back to Milton Friedman. It's only 14 years since Friedman died, and yet I don't think he would have appreciated in his lifetime how powerful and influential the private sector and the technology sector could become, even in that period of time. So we need everyone to focus on ethics as something incredibly practical. We need more frameworks like the one that I have presented today to help managers and shareholders and stakeholders understand how challenges recur and what to do about them. We need to look directly at them and invest accordingly. I believe Friedman was wrong, particularly today. Today, the business of business is not just business. The business of business is shaping the fourth industrial revolution. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Nick. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Great. Well, that was fascinating. We only have 3 minutes for questions, unfortunately, but just a general question here, which is maybe an unfair question, because it's a very, very, I think, hard one to answer. But you get many people saying that business controls the world. Some people think that's a conspiracy theory. Some people are convinced on it, that these powerful forces, in the past it was these big families, I don't want to mention any names, but that they control the world, not the politicians, not the people. Can you comment on that? And what would you say about that, if it's getting more like that or less like that? Yeah.
Yeah. So I think there's a grain of truth and there's a massive danger. So some technology companies are more influential with people around the world than the governments that those people respond to, because they have a very close relationship and they offer free and lifestyle enhancing services that give them power over the way that people run their days. And some businesses, if they threaten to pull out of a particular area, they really do threaten people's lives who rely on them. Ride sharing is a great example of that. People have changed their lives to rely on ride sharing, and there's huge benefits in the cost effectiveness of that. But there's a massive danger there in saying that because technology firms and the private sector has more power, it means they run the world, because that takes people down the path of saying there's nothing we can do about it. And that's where I fundamentally disagree. We need to reassert our power as individuals, as collective, as populations, and as communities, and actually work across sectors, vote, get out there, register, get engaged, and support the kind of collective action that moves us in the right direction. It's not about conspiracies. It's about understanding that we can design a better system together. But if we give up and say that it's all about powerful people undermining our interests all the time, that will disempower us. So we should acknowledge the power, but do something about it, is my key message here.
Okay, thank you. And last question, it's from the audience. It regards a topic which came up with Professor Harari about fake news, which is obviously, a huge topic of our time. I mean, what challenges will it create, and what should we do about fake news?
I'm a big believer that that technology regulation needs to come in and deal with fake news. So part of this is better algorithms understanding where there are flags, and we've already started to see that happen. I would argue, though, that the biggest sociological question, like Yuval said, it's not a technological fix. You can't just change the platform to try and solve the problem of fake news. You actually need to build more trust between people of different views and different perspectives. And you also need to invest in people's security. So we want people's economic, psychological, mental, community security to be something that brings us together, rather than a way of making people feel insecure so that they become paranoid and share fake news. There's very interesting sociological and psychological research about why people share fake news and different ideas that go against essentially cohesiveness in society. And often they do it to build trust with one another, which shows that this narrative of a lack of trust is one of the things that's undermining how we can work together better. Let's not put all our eggs in saying Twitter needs to change or Facebook needs to change, although I believe they can and do. The core issue here is actually much more on a community connection level. And that's where I think we have been underinvesting for many generations.
Well, thank you, Nick. Listen, I have to wrap it up there. As I was asking that question, I just realized what a loaded term that fake news is. So that's a whole different discussion. But that's the nature of the discussions we're having today. That we could talk for hours and hours. So thank you very much, Nick, for joining us, and have a very nice rest of the day.
Thank you.